Hello everyone and welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. In today's video, we're going to take a look at chapter 13, Meiosis and Sexual Life Cycles. This chapter is broken down into 4 sections, so I'll be making 2 videos for this chapter. Section 1 talks about offspring acquire genes from parents by inheriting chromosomes. Section 2, fertilization and meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles. Then in the next video, we'll go into section 3 and 4, which is meiosis, reduces the number of chromosome sets from diploid to haploid. And the last section, 4, genetic variation produced in sexual life cycles contributes to evolution. Okay, so ultimately, what we see here, as you take a look at this little diagram here, figure 13.1, the family members shown in this photo have similar features. Offspring resemble their parents more than they do unrelated individuals. So in this chapter, we're going to understand the molecular mechanics as to why offspring looks more related to the parents and not any random individual via the process of meiosis. So what biological mechanisms account for the resemblance between offspring and their parents? The whole scope of this chapter is ultimately producing gametes or sex cells. And the female and male sex cells coming from the father and the mother. Ultimately, through the process of fertilization, you get a new individual, or the zygote, in which half the chromosomes that are coming into the new individual is from the father and the other half is from the mother. So we're going to take a look at that in this particular chapter. Okay. So section 13.1, offspring acquire genes from their parents by inheriting chromosomes. There's a lot of terminology we need to go over. And one of the main things we need to talk about are genes and the genome. So the genome is essentially all the genes that we're comprised of, right? The sum of all our genes in the individual. And we get these genes from our parents, right? Half from the mother, half from the father. And that creates the genome. Now, a gene in itself are specific sections of DNA, and they code for particular traits. Now, we're going to see this a lot more in detail in the later chapters, so don't worry so much on the specifics there. Just know that they're a specific area in the DNA having a specific code of nucleotide sequence, and that sequence will ultimately create a protein which will create a trait for the individual. Okay, and these genes are going to start turning on as we develop, as fertilization occurs, where the male sex cell and the female sex cell join together. You start to get a whole symphony of genes turning on and off at certain times, and so forth, ultimately to create that new individual. And again, what are genes in themselves? They're specific segments of DNA. What is DNA? We mentioned this in chapter 5 on the nucleic acids. Now we're going to go back into this at the molecular level on gene expression and protein synthesis in chapter 16. So for now, just know that there's specific sections of DNA. Okay, and this idea of passing down information from parent to offspring is in essence the whole process of meiosis and fertilization. Okay, so this process is analogous to the symbolic information of language, in which words and sentences are translated to mental images. This is what a gene is. Okay, and then different types of genes can program cells. Again, this is a little bit beyond what we're going to talk about, but everything is a kind of manipulation of what genes turn on and off. Okay, and so that cumulative action of genes and their regulation, is what creates an individual. So that's why we need to pass this information from a parent to offspring. In order to do that, in order for a cell, for an individual cell, let's say a single-celled organism, to pass down their DNA to an offspring or to these new daughter cells that are going to form, DNA needs to be copied. That process of copying DNA is referred to as replication, DNA replication. So you produce copies of genes, and then those copies will be passed down to the parent, from the parent to the offspring. Okay, so genes, very important for you to understand what genes are, because we're going to be talking about it a lot in these following chapters. Related to these are gametes. Okay, this is a more kind of scientific term on what you call reproductive cells. Okay, or these sex cells, they're called gametes there, and they're the ones that will transmit the genes from one generation to the next. Okay, what we know of as the sperm and egg, right? Sperm for male and eggs for female. And then you have a process in which these eggs fuse together, which is called fertilization. It's the process of fusion between a sperm cell and an ovum or an egg cell. And then ultimately you get the genes from both parents, reestablishing the chromosome number. Now I'm going to get to that a little bit later, so don't worry about that for now. Okay, almost all of DNA in an eukaryotic cell is subdivided into chromosomes. Okay, so we have a certain amount of strands of DNA. These strands of DNA are essentially chromosomes, and we have 46 chromosomes in each and every cell in our body of humans. Different organisms have different amounts of chromosomes. Okay, and in our case, we have 46. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Now, this number, of course, varies depending on the species. We do, and we can find DNA in other little parts of the cell, like the mitochondria and the chloroplast. They have small amounts of DNA, but the large amount of DNA that is used to organize and maintain the cell is in the nucleus. Okay. So every living species has a characteristic number of chromosomes. Okay. Humans have 46 chromosomes in their somatic cells. This is another term that you need to start familiarizing yourself with, which is your body cells. Okay? Or all the cells in your body with the exception of sex cells, okay, or gametes, and their precursors. So we have 46 chromosomes. Right, just to go a little bit down here, each chromosome consists of a single DNA molecule associated with several proteins. So we've talked about this in terms of chromatin, right? That they're kind of coiled around with histone molecules and whatnot, and other proteins that are involved in their regulation. And then, aside from this idea of structure, we also have location, where each gene is in the span of the chromosome. So there are hundreds of thousands of genes per chromosome, okay, in our body. And they can also be found at a particular location. This is called a locus. Okay, that specific location where you find a particular gene is referred to as a locus, or along the length of a chromosome. Okay, and again, we're going to see visuals later on. Let's continue here. Now, before we get into the process of meiosis, just to kind of reiterate what asexual and sexual reproduction is, organisms that reproduce asexually, okay, can produce offspring that are identical copies of themselves. Okay, asexual, there's no interaction between any other individual and any other DNA, so it is only one individual. That individual copies their DNA and gives it to the daughter cells. One cell copies its DNA perfectly and will give each daughter cell the same identical DNA. This is referred to as asexual reproduction. Okay, one parent will donate the genes to the offspring. Okay, there's absolutely no fusion of gametes, and some examples. You see this more in single-celled organisms. Here you have this example of Hydra. Okay, but you could have this in multicellular organisms like these trees that of redwood. They can arise asexually from a single parent tree whose stump is in the center of the circle. So a single parent via mitosis and asexual reproduction can produce identical individuals. Okay. Whenever you produce an identical individual, this form of reproduction will give rise to a clone, and that's essentially what a clone is, right? It's a group of genetically identical individuals. Okay. You could have variation within a clone just because of mutations. But in theory, if you're getting an identical sequence of DNA without any problems arising, you can have a variation, okay, in the clone. But aside from that, those special cases, you'll get an identical individual. Sexual reproduction is when two parents produce offspring that have a unique combination of genes that are inherited from both parents. Okay? So we as individuals are heterozygous. We have a unique combination of genes. And as we pass down these genes, they get shuffled around. And that new individual organism will have a unique combination of these genes. So you're going to have variability. Again, this is something else we're going to see in more detail. And this genetic variability will create an individual that's unique, right? Similar in a way to the parents, but unique in themselves also, that they're even different from their brothers and sisters, for example. Okay. So asexual reproduction is identical individuals being produced. Sexual reproduction, you have individuals with more variation. All right. Section 13.2, fertilization and meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles. A life cycle, okay, what does that imply? Is the generation to generation sequence of stages in the reproductive history of an organism from the moment that you're born, or not born, but you're conceived, okay, to the moment that that new organism produces its own offspring. Okay, is referred to as a life cycle. And in order to create a new individual, of course, you need to have your own unique set of chromosomes. Each somatic cell has 46 chromosomes. Now, as you're conceived and you have that new single cell that contains information from the mother and father, what happens? You start to undergo mitosis. And mitosis, you know already that it's a form of cell division where you are creating diploid and diploid individuals. Okay. And every new cell will have its set of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes, and so forth, right? And what's interesting is that scientists were able to figure out, these processes in themselves because during cell division, as you know already, that the DNA becomes condensed, highly condensed. And so much so that scientists have figured out a way to sort them out, and they can really be distinguished from one chromosome to another by their size and position of the centromere and the patterning of staining if you were to use certain dyes. Ultimately, you create what is called a karyotype, as you see here in this image, and ultimately this particular diagram. You may have seen this before in biology or in the media, in the news and whatnot, right? This is referred to as a karyotype, where you're sorting out all the chromosomes that you have of a particular organism. Okay. Let me go back a little bit with the notes here. So you have this display and you arrange the chromosomes into a particular order. More specifically, these 46 chromosomes are actually arranged in pairs. Okay. And these pairs, ultimately, we have 23 pairs, come from 23 from the mother, 23 from the father. In total, we have 46 chromosomes, but moreover, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes because each pair contains similar information coming from each parent. Okay? And each pair of chromosome has its own characteristics. Let's take a look back at this particular diagram. You see pair number 1 of chromosomes. Okay? You see, look how long they are. Look at their banding of the different stains, okay, and so forth. So one thing to note is that a karyotype is made whenever the DNA is condensing as they're about to divide. Okay, since they're dividing, remember they're in the process of dividing, they are undergoing, prophase and metaphase and so forth. So they're in the chromatid state. So if you see here, you have one chromosome with its copy, the other chromosome with its other copy. So chromosome number 1 and 2, you can think about it as a homologous pair. Pair number 1, pair number 2 and 3 and 4 and so forth until you get, to that 22nd pair and then the sex chromosomes that I'm going to talk about in a bit. All right. So in itself, each structure that you see here is a chromosome, and then you have its pair which has similar information. They are grouped together into what are called homologs. Okay, this is a new concept that you guys need to memorize. All right, they're called homologous chromosomes. When you have, let's say, chromosome number 1 and number 2, they make one pair. Okay, and again, they are ordered together based on their length, centromere position, staining pattern, and whatnot. And so you have this pairing of chromosomes because they contain similar information, similar genes at the same loci or the locus. Okay. The only ones that are really, really different in the pairing are the sex chromosomes, which is the X and Y chromosomes that you see here at the bottom. Okay. These are the only ones that are really different from each other. But if you notice, all other pairings are quite similar in terms of length and size. One thing that's quite interesting, that as you go down the homologous pairing, the size of the chromosomes will start to decrease. Okay, until you get these itty bitty ones, chromosome pair number 22. Okay, but that we're going to talk about later. Okay, so you have these sex chromosomes that are X and Y, and they are, again, like I mentioned before, an exception to the general pattern of homologous chromosomes. They're involved with the sexual characteristics that determine what we will come out, right, as a female or a male. And human females have a homologous pair of X chromosomes, or XX, and males have a pairing of X and Y chromosomes. In this particular case, this is a male individual just because you have these two pairings here. If it was a female, you would have 2 of these particular structures that you see that I'm circling in with my mouse here. Okay, but since it's a male individual, you have X and Y. Okay, so most genes on the X chromosome are not found on the tiny Y chromosomes. It's just physically too small that it doesn't carry anything that is related, that the X chromosome has. Only a tiny part of the X and Y chromosome are actually homologous. They're similar to each other. Okay. Some other similar terms, the other 22 pairs of chromosomes, they're referred to as autosomes, just because they're not pertaining to sexual characteristics. They are the autosomes. And then you have one pair of sex chromosomes. Okay. And then the occurrence of homologous pairs of chromosomes is a consequence of sexual reproduction. Again, you're getting chromosomes from the father and from the mother. They're fusing together. Okay, so now we're adding a little bit more of complexity here. Not too much. So we have 46 chromosomes, like I mentioned before, but they're organized into 23 pairs. Okay, a maternal set and a paternal set. Okay. So continuing on, just a little bit of representation and how we kind of annotate things that are related to chromosome number. Okay. In biology, the chromosome number is referred to as the letter N. And this N is, when you refer to this letter, you're referring to one set of chromosomes. Let's say a set coming from the father, that is one N. And then you have a set coming from the mother, that is another N. And when you fuse them together, okay, you will have a 2N individual, as you see here. So a cell with two sets of chromosomes is called a diploid cell. Each and has a number of diploid, number of chromosomes, and it's abbreviated 2N. Each of our cells in our body right now, with the exception of the sex organs that are producing sex cells, okay, are diploid. Okay? The cells in our skin, the cells in our eyes, the cells in our intestines and whatnot, they're all diploid cells because we have the complete 46, 23 pairs of chromosomes. Again, I know I reiterate this a lot. It's becoming redundant. One pair from the father, one set from the mother. Okay? So we're 2N individuals. But sperm cells and egg cells, or ova, in general, gametes, they only have one set of chromosomes, the 22 autosomes and one sex chromosome. So they're referred to, because they only have one complete set of chromosomes, as a haploid cell. You can think about the haploid as half the number of chromosomes, and it's abbreviated, I didn't put this here, as N. Okay, so I want to establish that. Our normal body cells are 2N in terms of chromosome sets. We have two sets of chromosomes. Only our sex cells have half that number, which is just N. We only have one set of chromosomes. Okay, so any sexually reproducing species has a characteristic haploid and diploid numbers of chromosomes. Okay. For humans, our haploid number is 23, and our diploid number is 46. In a fruit fly, Drosophila, 2N equals 8. Our diploid, the diploid number is 8, and then the haploid number is 4. Okay. And lastly, just to give you another example there, the domestic dog, the diploid number is 78, and the haploid is 39 numbers of chromosomes. Okay, so in a cell in which DNA synthesis has occurred, all the chromosomes are duplicated. Okay, each duplicated chromosome consists of two identical sister chromatids. All right, so DNA in that S phase of interphase, if you guys remember, is where DNA synthesis occur, and any body somatic cell will always copy its chromosome number. So each new daughter cell will always have that number of chromosomes and keep the number stable. All right. In terms of behavior of human life cycle, we bounce from diploid to haploid to diploid to haploid. Okay, and the human life cycle begins again when the haploid sperm cell. So let's take a look at this visual here. You have the sperm, an N cell. You have an egg, which is also an N cell. They fuse together through the process of fertilization, and they establish again the diploidy, the diploid number of chromosomes, which is 46. After that, from that single cell on, you will undergo mitosis, division, development. The organism is getting bigger as it's growing inside the womb of the mother. It's born, becomes an adult, and then you get sexual reproduction. Again, you're producing sex cells to undergo sexual reproduction, and then the process begins again. Okay? So you have meiosis and fertilization, meiosis, fertilization. So you're bouncing from these two forms of chromosome number. Okay? which is ultimately the family line of generations. So as a person develops from a zygote to a sexually mature adult, mitosis will generate all the somatic cells of the body. Okay. So each somatic cell contains a full diploid set of chromosomes, as I mentioned before. Now, something about gametes. Okay, the gametes develop in the gonads, and the gonads are essentially the reproductive organs of the body. And this is the more scientific name, and it's the testes for males and ovaries for females. It's a more general term, and they are not produced by mitosis. They are not produced by mitosis. The gametes, the sex cells. Okay? They are produced, they come from specialized cells that are called germ cells that are in the gonad. And these cells, these germ cells, will undergo a new process that we know as meiosis. And meiosis will take these germ cells to divide from a diploid member to produce daughter cells that have a haploid member. That is the whole process of meiosis, which we're going to see in the later sections here. Okay. Now, different organisms have a different way to do this process. So there's a variety of sexual life cycles. But ultimately, you have these two things occurring. Meiosis, where you're producing a haploid cells, undergo fertilization to produce a diploid situation or diploid individual, and then it'll go back to meiosis and a cycle. Okay, so fertilization and meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles. And you see this in many organisms, right? Plants, fungi, protists, animals, all these different forms of life. It varies among species in terms of timing and how long it takes and the structures that are being formed. And they can be grouped into three main types of life cycles. We focus more on humans, of course, because we are humans and mammalian systems, right? Where you have the first type of life cycle in which gametes are only haploid cells, but then you get that fusion of these haploid cells, okay, egg and sperm. They fertilize, they produce a zygote. Okay? A zygote is that first single cell after fertilization. That zygote will then divide under mitosis to produce an adult individual through time, which will undergo themselves certain structures. Will undergo meiosis. Okay, so most animals have the first type of life cycle in which gametes are the only haploid cells, and then they will divide through several processes. Okay. And then plants and algae have another type of life cycle that is called alternation of generations. This is quite interesting, beyond the scope of AP Bio, that for now. But if you're studying the whole Campbell series chapters, you still need to know this, right? So you have alternation of generations, where you have different life cycles of the plant that are multicellular. So you actually have multicellular organisms that are diploid and that are haploid. Let's take a look. The first one, where you have one diploid organism, the sporophyte. Okay, and that sporophyte will undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. Okay, so here, let's say you have this particular structure here. I'll start here at the bottom. This is a diploid plant. Okay, it's referred to as a sporophyte. This diploid plant, okay, will undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. Okay, these are the little spores. So the diploid plant will produce cells that will undergo meiosis and liberate these little structures here that are called spores. These spores are haploid. Of course, they've undergone meiosis. These spores will then undergoes cell division. Okay, mitosis, but everything is haploid. This organism, multicellular, is growing and growing and growing. It's referred to as a gametophyte. And gametophytes, the entire organism is haploid. And then they would produce the actual sex structure, the gametes, okay, which would fuse with some other plant that is producing gametes, male or female gametes, and they would fuse together to produce a diploid individual again via fertilization that will develop into the sporophyte. Sporophyte produces haploid cells, which will produce a gametophyte. Gametophytes will produce cells that are more specialized for reproduction. They will fertilize to produce the sporophyte again. So you're bouncing from generations. That's why it's called alternation of generations, where you have a sporophyte, gametophyte, gametophyte. Independent plants, okay? Depending on the plant type, okay? And then you have fungi and protists. They have another type of life cycle where the gamete fuses to form a zygote, and this is the only diploid phase. Okay, so you have this zygote. There's no real form of mitosis and individual forming complex structures. It will directly undergo meiosis, and then that meiosis will have your haploid cells, which will then fertilize again and again and again. Okay, so gametes fuse to form a zygote, which is the only diploid phase. That zygote will undergo meiosis in itself, okay, to produce haploid cells, and then these haploid cells, again, as I mentioned before, will divide by mitosis to form, a unicellular daughter cell or a haploid multicellular adult organism. Okay. So just to give you a sense, in summary, the only diploid stage in these particular organisms is that single cell zygote. Okay. So no matter what you're seeing of an organism, there will always be a haploid time, a haploid stage, and a diploid stage within the life of the organism. Okay, but again, you do need to know some specifics there. In this context of AP, but in Campbell Biology also, they tend to focus more on mammalian systems, particularly humans also. Okay. All right. So, although 3 types of sexual life cycles differ in the timing of meiosis and fertilization, there is something that is critical that always happens, which is genetic variation. And that is probably the single most important thing about sexual reproduction is genetic variation. You want to have offspring that are different genetically from the parent, because as we're going to see later on, some of the main reasons are for survival. Okay, so in the next video we're going to talk about section 13.3. Meiosis reduces the number of chromosome sets from diploid to haploid. This is probably one of the concepts that you need to know in great detail no matter what level of biology you are, and we're going to go through each of the phases of meiosis, which is broken down into meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And what I recommend to my students is that if you understand these 2 panels here of the diagram with the descriptions, you should be able to master the whole process. Very, very straightforward there that we're going to take a look at. Okay. So thank you very much. I hope you found the video useful, and I'll be back with the next part soon.